Okay, so let's get started. We are on time, so far so good. Let's get started with the open source and WebRTC panel. And we have a very good representation of the open source WebRTC industry here. Okay, so two messages from the organizers. First one, after the panel, we'll have a coffee break just in the aisle for 15 minutes. Okay, so let's take the opportunity to network with all the presenters and also with all the people we have here. Second message, we have a Twitter hashtag, which is WebRTC BCM. Victor, is that it? Okay, so feel free to make some noise on Twitter. So let's get started. First, let's make a presentation of the panelists. I will start with the list, so let's follow that order. First one is Daniel-Constantin Mierla. Okay, so if you want to make a quick introduction of who you are, I think that pretty much all we know you, but just if there is someone missing.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm one of the main developers of Kamailio project, which is a SIP signaling server with support for WebSockets. So practically you can use it to make calls between browsers without any extra application. Of course, on the browser you need a SIP stack. There are a couple of very good ones out there. So yeah, probably short introduction is the best. If you need, you can approach me later.
Okay, next one is John Deruelle from Telestax.
Hi, I'm one of the Telestax co-founder, and basically the Telestax is a company behind MobiSense, which is one of the biggest open source Java communication platform. And I've been one of the main MobiSense developer for years as well. And we are aiming with Telestax to make it more easy for web developers to build a real-time communication application. So we do support WebRTC through SIP over WebSockets and also through regular WebSockets if you want to build your own proprietary protocol.
Okay, thanks, Jing. Next panelist on the list is Torrey from Voxbone.
Hello, I'm Torrey. I lead the R&D team at Voxbone. We use a lot of open source in our network, primarily Kamailio, to use a proper pronunciation, and Asterisk. And we are in the process of doing a beta of having our telephone numbers reachable via our WebRTC API using SIP over WebSockets, using JSIP, ephemeral auth, and various other technologies in the open source domain.
Okay, thanks for the explanation. Next one is Alexey Aylarov from Zingaya. Alexey, please.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Alexey, and I'm CEO and co-founder of Zingaya. We have two products. One is Zingaya. It's a click-to-call service for businesses, which utilizes WebRTC, of course, because you can make a call from a browser. And second product is a Voxbone platform for developers of real-time communication applications. The interesting thing about it, in addition to its support of WebRTC, of course, that you can write server-side scripts in JavaScript as well. So it's like Node.js in terms of call control logic you can deploy in our cloud, and then you can control the routing using JavaScript applications and integrate it with your backend. So web developers usually like it. So give it a try, and you can ask me questions after the panel or during the event.
Okay, sure. Next panelist is Peter Dunkley from Acision.
Hello, I'm Peter Dunkley. I'm a technical director at Acision in what's called the Rich Engagement Services Business Unit. Basically, that means I'm an evangelist and also the person in charge of the architecture of our various products. There's a number of them, but one of which is the Forge by Acision developer platform. At a previous company that was acquired by Acision, I did a lot of open source contributions to Kamailio, including implementing the SIP over WebSockets, which I believe Torrey's using, and the ephemeral authentication module, which I believe Torrey's using.
You're very popular.
Okay. Well, my code is.
Thanks for that, Peter. We appreciate your contribution.
Okay, so thanks, Peter. And last but not least, we have with us Matthew Hodgson from matrix.org.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Matthew from Matrix. I'm the technical co-founder of matrix.org, which we see as the missing signaling standard for HTTP, standardized signaling for WebRTC. So this is a completely open source project, I guess like Kamailio, or however I meant to pronounce it, except rather than focusing on zip, we've gone and defined a very simple set of REST APIs for going and setting up WebRTC calls, instant messaging, in fact, any JSON. So you can use it for Internet of Things, data, persistence, and transfer. We've gone and released a bunch of Apache open source licensed reference implementations. And it's kind of early days. We launched in September, but it's good to be here.
Okay, thanks. Many thanks for the panelists for the very concrete and specific explanation of what you do. So we have a very diverse panel here because we have people with a developer profile, existing companies, service providers. I think it can be an interesting discussion. We have 25 minutes, more or less. So I would like to start to hit up a bit the room with two questions. We are mainly the same question with a small change. The first one is, where do you see that open source can contribute to the WebRTC industry from a technical point of view? I mean, do you think that the open source solution can be excellent at the gateway level, for example, or as the framework level, or in the codec area, or wherever? Where do you see that there can be more room for innovation in the technical side of the WebRTC industry? And the second one, it's the same question, but regarding the business. So where do you think in the WebRTC landscape that open source can play a role to boost business and to make really a sustainable business model behind WebRTC, being itself WebRTC an open source project from the beginning? So I will hand it up to Peter, for example, okay? And after that, we can have some catch-up discussion with the audience, or if you have any questions, please wait until the end of the panelist session. Okay, so Peter, what do you think about that?
Well, I don't actually think they're really separate questions. Open source is great. Open source is wonderful. And open source isn't actually necessarily easy to pick up and use. Now, what that means is an awful lot of the people who are developing WebRTC stuff, they want to pick something up and they want to move quickly. You know, you will have people who are app developers, they're writing something in their evening and weekends perhaps, and so they want to pick something up and be able to use it. That means that they need something that works right away, possibly that has some level of support. And with open source, sometimes that's not always there, because even companies that write open source, it's not always in their interest to make it too easy for people. You know, we have to sell support, we have to eat, we have to pay our mortgages. So I think actually a lot of the business case that's there is the fact that a lot of people are using open source from a variety of combinations, both in their clients and in their networks. But actually, when you look at your average app developer, many of whom are great ideas guys and great UI guys, they're not necessarily signaling guys. And if something goes wrong, however open the source is, they're going to perhaps struggle, not because they're not capable of doing it, but perhaps they just don't have the time to do it. So I actually think that open source is very important to WebRTC. The Google library, everything like that is open source. But where does the business model come from for an awful lot of people, for an awful lot of developers? They need a little bit of help to do this, and that's where companies that are selling developer platforms and other things, much of which are built on open source, that's actually where the money is going to come from. That's where the revenue stream with open source is going to come from.
Okay, Daniel?
Okay, so I'm originally from Romania. I'm, in that country we don't really eat that much as we are vampires. So I'm focusing more on the technical side. So I'll have more or less like 3 points combining the two questions. Where I would like to see it, it's more like having good frameworks for a better user experience in communication, because all of us know that what kept the real-time communication or the voice over IP a bit back was poor user interface. Practically the same interface as with the classic telephony we got on the voice over IP phones. And I hope here we'll get improvements, and eventually open source could consolidate 2-3 frameworks that everyone can reuse and give a very nice experience to their customers. That would be one. Another one would be on these problems that were highlighted before by the speakers, mainly video codecs or all these technologies where you somehow have to pay or you get a hard time access to licensing and this kind of business model from an open source point of view. Even now it's unclear, this H264, what you have to do as an open source project or company working with open source to get access to and be safe from point of view, because they say, okay, if you have just a few number of licenses, we don't get any money, but maybe you do something viral and then they start suing you. So I think that's a problem from long-term business point of view. And then for the business, I think the open source is the chance for telecoms. They are really behind with internet communication. Fortunately for them, open source has very good frameworks out there, including server side, client side. They just need to recognize and pick up this train. Otherwise, we know voice is just another app now. If they are waiting for like big vendors to ship big fridges out there, probably they are gonna lose the entire fight. So I think open source is the chance for the telcos. They must acknowledge that and somehow get more involved in this area.
Okay, thanks. Torrey?
So my view about WebRTC and open source is I really think that open source is the playground, the front runner, the place where people are experimenting, testing the ideas before, I'll say, a commercial sellable product can ever be materialized. Because when you have the code out there, you can play with it. The guy who's playing with the Raspberry Pi, he's not going to go and buy a license from somebody to just experiment with a commercial stack. He wants to download stores, tinker it, adapt its needs. It's the framework where you can actually experiment with it. And I think that's where open source is really going to drive WebRTC is, because it allows people to express these ideas and come up with ideas that nobody else has think of before, and eventually come up with a great idea. And in terms of monetizing on open source, in the case of Voxbone, we are a service provider. We are not making money by selling boxes, so the fact that the software that's on our boxes is free is kind of irrelevant. And what the value added for us of open source is we do have access to the code. When we see something is misbehaving, and it does happen even in the best of open source projects, we have the ability to go in and quickly solve issues and react quickly in terms of improving the experience of our customers. So.
Okay, it's a nice point of view. Okay, Jean?
Okay. I tend to agree that for the open source, it's the goal is to reduce friction for the web developers so that they can start to play and tinker for free. Because usually developers is not where they have money. They like to build everything for free and then do a business, a go-to-market. But it's not only about the developers. There is a lot of things where open source is important. The very fact that WebRTC is open source is one of the key elements into adoption. And we could see that even though H264 was had constraint, Cisco and Mozilla work together to kind of have an open H264 codec. So it's not only about the framework. I think open source is helping everywhere. And from the server-side infrastructure for the integration of services with developers, and from the vendors themselves. On the business side, there is platforms or developers that are very successful into launching services like Snapchat and integrating WebRTC. It's not the case of everyone to have this type of reach. So what we are trying to do to help that from the open source point of view is create an open marketplace where we can do matchmaking between service providers and developers of applications so that developer application can get a broader reach by going to service provider that have platform installed and where they can launch the service and discuss with the service providers on how to generate revenue out of WebRTC together.
Okay, interesting. Matthew?
Yeah, I guess it's interesting to hear open source described as the playground because I guess from my perspective it's more the foundation for the whole thing. If you look at it in terms of openness versus closedness, I mean, forget WebRTC, forget the source code element of it. You look at how the internet came about as a very open, collaborative system, which basically created a new industry. And then suddenly, people realize that they can monetize it and build proprietary closed systems on top, which provide value. And you get this kind of duality happening between an open platform, which enables commercial activity, and then all the proprietary silos which get built on top. And the interesting thing is that the sort of pattern repeats itself. We had it at first with the internet, then you have it again with the web coming on, and in the early days of Web 1.0, it's lots of GeoCities sites, and then people start building commerce on top. You have the same pattern again with Web 2.0, and now we're seeing it again with WebRTC. So WebRTC is obviously fundamentally open source, and that's in its very, very nature. And we have to invest and make the most of all of the open source infrastructure that basically powers it. Just like Linux is open source and powers many, many aspects of all of our computing nowadays, and came after the proprietary Unixes of the past. So in my mind, it's the yin and yang, that in order to have any commercial healthy enterprise, you also need to have the open collaboration underneath. And it's really exciting being involved in WebRTC in these early days, where WebRTC, obviously itself, the stacks are almost all open. And now we also have the signaling protocols to glue them together as a open collaborative industry that people can then build the value on top of. So that's my take.
Okay. Alexey, please.
Okay, so if we're talking about technical, from technical point of view, I would divide it into few parts. Like, we have client side, we have server side, we have stacks we discussed today. So if we are talking about stacks and low-level things like codecs, which are not that sexy, like, client side, etc., we still need to have open source there, because it's much easier for companies to develop WebRTC stacks when they are open sourced. And Mozilla, for example, uses a big part of Google's code. Probably Google can use something from Mozilla's code base. And in the end of the day, everybody wins, because we can move faster, we can add more features. For example, every implementation I saw uses libjingle from Google, as far as I know, at least some parts of it. If we are talking about the client side, JavaScript in browser is kind of open, right? So it's really hard to compile it to something, and everybody is just putting the code everywhere, showing their demos for WebRTC. So everything on the client side is pretty open. So you can take any demo and use it everywhere you want. You can build your own apps based on other apps, and that's where power of WebRTC is. We don't need to hide anything, right? It's better to share knowledge, and it also allows us to move faster with better apps. And if you're talking about the mid part of it, like media servers, media gateways used in this space. So we got a lot of colleagues here who are working a lot on this part of WebRTC ecosystem. Open source is still very important, right? We have all these great applications in servers, and you still can take it and try to build your own using it. And it depends on licensing, of course, but in the end of the day, everybody wins when we use open source. So I don't see how we could move faster if we don't have open source ideology behind WebRTC. If we're talking about business, business is another story. It's open source helps sometimes. Sometimes it's not that helpful. But in the end of the day, I believe it actually increases competition on the market. It requires companies to build more powerful and make things with better quality, and you need to compete in pricing, etc., etc. So in the end of the day, open source in terms of business also allows our market to grow faster, and it depends on who is more successful there. So it's about building better product.
Okay, thanks. So I have one question for all of you, but you can take the question when you want. So being a WebRTC, an open source solution from the beginning, from scratch, did you see that right now that we are in the early days of WebRTC? I think we all agree in that. Do you see that the frameworks and the libraries, there will be a consolidation for one or two frameworks at each, let's say, section of WebRTC? Do you see really people reusing existing libraries like we've done in other languages, or do you think that maybe there will be more fragmentation, like we can see, for example, at the signaling level?
There'll be a lot of fragmentation, and that's a good thing, because no two applications are the same. While it's important that some applications can communicate with each other, it's equally important that some can't. If I'm got a banking application on my phone that I'm using to talk to my bank, I don't really want somebody with a social chat application receiving those messages. Walled gardens are actually good in some places. It's application specific. So there's going to be a lot of fragmentation because the right thing, what is the right thing, depends on what your application is.
Yeah.
On a similar vein, I think that having several stacks is actually quite a good thing. Coming from a telecom background, I can just look at SIP, and there are hundreds upon hundreds of different SIP stack implementations out there, and due to a lot of sweat, blood, and tears and interop testing, there is a very high interoperability with it, and I don't see any reason why, without sufficient testing and frameworks to test, the same can't happen with WebRTC as long as the specs keep in place.
Okay. And do you think maybe that, as happens in other fields, that having too much fragmentation can lead to some, let's say, the market being worried about so many fragmentations, so there won't be investment?
Well, I think someone already else said earlier, and I agree with it, as long as the core is in place and is highly interoperable, people can still add their special add-on features to give a unique twist, and then that would only be used in their own walled garden, so to speak. So, yeah.
It also depends what part you're talking about fragmenting. Are you talking about fragmenting of the media stack or fragmenting of the signaling? Because at the end of the day, WebRTC is the media stack. You know, that's what it is. And it's quite likely that there will be 3 or 4 media stacks. At the moment, there's really only 1 or 2 usable ones. There might be 3 or 4, and they all interoperate with each other. From the signaling point of view, which is the thing that enables that computer to talk to that computer, the media stack is the how they talk, but actually enabling them to connect, that's the signaling. And, you know, I mean, in the stuff that I'm working on, we primarily use SIP, but it's completely wrappered in our APIs, so you wouldn't know that if it wasn't for the fact that I just said it. And with the stuff we're using, I use SIP. You know, but you wouldn't know it if I hadn't said that, because it's completely hidden from the application developer. And the way we set some applications up, they can only talk to other applications that they're meant to talk to, and other applications can talk globally, because what you need to do is very specific to the app. So fragmentation in the signaling plane, that's great, that's wonderful. The more options we get out there, the ones that aren't very good will die off. The ones that are very good will actually inherit good features from the other ones. It will evolve, and that's great, and that's wonderful. But why would we be frightened of it?
Okay, Matthew, do you want to add something?
I think Matthew will want to say something about fragmentation on signaling plane. But before that, I just wanted to agree on one point: is as long as the media is working and interoperable between the browser or the native stack on the mobile, I think this is one of the key pieces. As long as you can talk to each other on the media side, then on the framework side, not speaking yet on the signaling side, but on the framework side, the goal for the developers is to have multiple toolbox, and they would use the right tool for the right job. So the more fragmentation there is on framework leads to more choices. It can be confusing for some developers to know which tool they have to use, but I think it's a good thing, because some framework will be very high level and trying to make it as simple as possible to interconnect people on the WebRTC side, and some will stay at a lower level. You get a lot of capabilities in terms of managing the media, echo cancellation, this type of stuff, where this is needed for certain type of applications.
Okay.
I'll leave it on signaling to Matthew.
Thank you, Jean. Fragmentation is something very close to my heart, because Matrix exists to fix the fragmentation problem. So I see where Peter's coming from in terms of saying that it isn't a problem and it's a good thing. However, I disagree. I think that it's probably the single biggest thing that is holding back WebRTC's potential as a universal communications medium. So to go to the example of you have your banking application and you're talking to your bank manager and not wanting that to interoperate with your social chat app. I mean, this to me is a classic example where I do want a generic application which stores all of my message history and all my conversations and all my contacts where I can talk to my bank manager. Why would I have to create an entirely different account on a different system to go and talk to my bank manager and have all of that conversation locked away in a different silo, which has only got any context in the meaning of my bank? What happens if I close my bank account? I want to know what I said to my bank manager when they refused my overdraft for the 50th time, when I go and change bank to the next guy, except in this WebRTC siloed world, I'm just never going to be able to see that data again. It's locked away in the old bank. So this is why I think it's absolutely key if WebRTC is going to fully take off and be the sort of backbone of communication on the internet, that there should be some standard way for things to interoperate on the signaling layer. Now SIP has got problems for doing this, and HTTP has, I think, a little bit more promise. Anyway, Peter.
The answer I will give you there is you're absolutely right from a person point of view, but if I was your bank, I don't want that. Okay, what I want is you to talk to me in my app with my branding. That's what I want.
So why should you stick up for the bank?
Because what I'm trying to say is that the people who write apps, right? The people who write the apps, they write the apps. The companies that write the apps to make life easier for them. Let's not pretend for a second that they're writing the apps to make it easier for you. The reason your bank has a mobile app is it's cheaper to service you through the mobile app than it is through having a mobile web browsing site and through having a phone line to come in. And it's really important to them that you communicate with them through their app, with their brand. Virgin Airlines has an app. British Airways has an app. They would not want there to be a generic airlines app. They want you in their portal. This is branding marketing 101. And so the reason I'm mentioning this I can fully understand what you're saying, and as from a consumer point of view, I can kind of see your point. But actually, the people who are writing the app have a heavily vested interest in keeping you in the app. Now, don't get me wrong, I think Matrix is great. I will almost certainly end up using it at some point as well. But what I'm trying to say is that from a proprietary app point of view, from the point of view of somebody who is designing an app, actually the silo is a benefit to me. Not to the customer, but actually as the owner of the app, the silo is a benefit to me. And as the writer of an app where it's siloed, if using Matrix makes it easier for me to write the app, I'll do so. But if actually it doesn't make a difference to me, I don't care. From a pragmatic point of view of the end goal, that's what I was talking about. Not a principled philosophical open source good or bad.
So I think we actually agree then. The point I'm just trying to make is that somebody needs to stick up for the end user here. Because sure, it's not in the interest of the corporations and the banks and all the silos. No, WhatsApp has no incentive at all to go and open up its community. It wants to trap everybody in there. But we, as human beings, as end users, get screwed over by it. Somebody needs to stick up for them and go and actually provide the technology that goes and provides a interoperability medium, and that's basically all we're trying to do. Anyway.
Okay, so we have something like 2 minutes for questions. So if there are any questions for the audience, okay.
The British guy
Microphone here, please. Microphone, is the microphone on the table?
Self-service.
Mohammed again. I would like to, I have a question and a comment basically regarding the WebRTC being open source. Me being from Asian background, I can assure you guys, open source really sells. It sells, especially after, because you know the Edward Snowden revelations, and that I think that guy really did a huge favor to the open source industry, because now people don't really trust, the proprietary software, because they're afraid that somebody have put some backdoor and you know this
How,
and
how
that
about
and that.
OpenSSL Heartbleed bugs then?
Yeah, but that, yeah. But whenever I go to a client and when I tell them, and they ask me, they are the first ones who ask me, are you going to develop this solution in open source technologies? Are you using the open source? Of course, I use open source. Several times I ask them why. Because they say, because it's open source. We can open it. We can hire somebody to scan it and search it if somebody has planted any bug or anything in whatever in it. And similarly, this Heartbleed bug, and then there was other bugs from the Oracle also discovered a bash-related bug and so on. So all these bugs, they quickly discovered and quickly got fixed.
It was there for 5 years or 10 years, I don't remember.
Yeah, wasn't discovered. Wasn't discovered, yeah. Anyway, the main hurdle we have in selling the open source projects to the clients or doing the business, I think, with respect to the WebRTC, is that it lacks the standardization. All the standard bodies like IETF or you can name it, all these standard bodies who are supposed to standardize the technology, which can be asked, which is asked by the customer. They ask us, okay, what standard does your technology support? I say, oh, there is one RFC release, RFC 7113, which is the WebRTC, but other than that, there is nothing.
Well, that was actually my point with telecom. If they wait for something to standardize, then it's too late for them. The idea is there are many standards, including SIP, XMPP, Matrix now. They don't need like a stamp on it, because when it's a stamp on it, practically you are already too late. Everyone has an alternative for that.
I have
So
the same
you have
feeling.
to change the mind of the telecom, and I hope they will see this, because I'm somehow relating it to telecom being in Barcelona at the event. Otherwise, there are many other business, but we had short time to discuss it.
Yeah.
And I think that if the telecom, it's waiting for standardization, it's too late for them. I could make some tough comments like, if a vendor builds it for you, you are the second one using it. So you can say you are the first loser, right?
Let's consider Apple Telecoms then, right? So Apple is waiting for kind of stamp or approval before they implement it in Safari, I guess. So we still haven't heard anything about WebRTC support from Apple, but maybe they are just waiting for version 1.0, like standardized to 100% or something like that. So they probably behave like telecoms here.
Well, I think they protect their FaceTime.
It's one of the versions.
Okay,
I'm too straight, James?
have time for more questions?
Open source, we have to be open here, right?
Okay, so we have time for one more question only, please. Okay.
My name is Khader. I work for Expo. We are into test and measurement, right? We do support, WebRTC testing and so on. The question is, there's a lot of fragmentation in signaling. And I also heard that in telecom, guys are not listening or whatever. My background is telecom, and now we all know that there's a public AT&T announcement. They have a big network, and they have deployed the APIs and so on. So they do hear. It's not that they don't hear. And I know that a lot of places, they are doing trials, a lot of things that are happening, which I cannot say where, but a lot of things are happening which is more faster than we internet guys are doing. I'm telling you, if they are going to come up with API, they not only let two people to talk in internet, but also they can connect to many access networks. So they have a lot of advantages from that perspective. And on the internet side, yeah, of course, we can do a lot of innovations and so on. So this is my point of view. And the question is, what I think is sometimes the standards are delayed and the telecom is really a little bit confused. Because take signaling as an example, we have 3 types of signaling that is majorly used, and different vendors are doing different signaling. And that is kind of slowing down the whole process. What can we do as a team to make this whole thing happen as one single standard would probably result in a advancement and pace in the WebRTC. That's my opinion. I would like to hear from your point of view. See, even in the panelist, I hear HTTP, I hear JSON, I hear SIP.
Can I talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, short answer, please. Let's keep it short.
A little, yeah. So today we heard about M2M and the Internet of the Things, etc., etc. So WebRTC is not only about audio and video calls, right? So if we would, if we chose something like one signaling standard, we couldn't cover all the applications we could build using WebRTC. Right now, for example, for mobile to mobile, what is the best protocol for signaling in this case? Should we go with MQTT like Facebook, or should we use HTTP2, which was just standardized, or should we use something else which will work for our use case to transmit data to satellites or something like that? So it's really hard to make a right decision because signaling is evolving together with use cases and with applications. So WebRTC, after all, is about media engine, data channels, data transfer, but signaling is something we can't cover using this standard. I mean, we got SDP, but probably that's it. It's my opinion.
Just very, very quickly, if you do consider signaling as just data synchronization of any kind of data sync, could be an instant message, could be WebRTC setup, could be Internet of Things data, and that's pretty extensible. And if you hypothetically created such a standard, then that possibly could be used as a generic signaling layer. But you can play it both ways.
Okay.
Just one thing on
okay.
that. On
30 seconds.
On the standardization, I think if we wait for telco to do standardization, we probably end up with something like RCS, so that are in the, and we don't want that.
Yeah. No. Nice move.